across the deserts of the Middle East, beneath shifting layers of sand and silence. Archaeologists continue to uncover foundations so massive that even modern engineers pause, measuring blocks the size of trucks and asking a quiet question that refuses to fade away. Who built this, and how? In textbooks, the answer is simple. Ancient civilizations were more advanced than we give them credit for. They possessed ingenuity, manpower, and time. They carved, lifted, aligned, and engineered with astonishing precision long before cranes and steel defined modern skylines. But sometimes the scale pushes the imagination. Stone platforms, weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together with joints so tight that a blade cannot slip between them. Foundations buried beneath later cities, older than the oldest written record preserved above. Now, before speculation takes over, let's ground this conversation in discipline. Archaeology does not confirm the existence of supernatural builders. It confirms human creativity, layered civilizations, and the reality that we often underestimate ancient capability. Yet here is where tension begins. The biblical narrative and Second Temple literature describe a pre-flood world filled with knowledge, architecture, metallurgy, and cities that rose rapidly under the influence of beings described as watchers. The Book of Enoch states that forbidden knowledge was transmitted before the flood, teaching humanity advanced skills in metalworking, cosmetics, weaponry, astronomy, and structural development, accelerating civilization in ways that disrupted moral boundaries. When we examine massive pre-flood narratives across cultures, from Mesopotamian epics to biblical genealogies, there is a recurring theme of early rapid advancement followed by catastrophic judgment, a reset that buries both cities and memory beneath sediment. Now consider the desert ruins. Sites like Baalbek in Lebanon contain foundation stones so enormous that modern cranes struggle to replicate the feat. Scholars explain it through manpower and engineering ramps, and those explanations are plausible. But what captures attention is not impossibility. It is disproportion. Foundations far larger than the visible structures above them. Earlier layers more ambitious than later reconstructions. Civilizations building smaller on top of something greater. That layering creates a haunting pattern, as if something ancient stood first, then diminished over time, leaving later generations to reuse fragments of a former scale they could not fully reproduce. Genesis describes a world before the flood filled with mighty men, warriors of renown. Enoch expands that imagery, suggesting hybrid offspring who dominated early cities. Whether literal or symbolic, the narrative emphasizes abnormal scale. So here is the question few Americans ask calmly. When archaeology uncovers foundations older and larger than surrounding civilizations, are we looking at exaggerated memory, lost engineering techniques, or something that once carried a reputation so powerful it survived millennia? Ancient peoples did not invent giant myths randomly. Nearly every early civilization preserves stories of towering rulers or primordial builders who shaped cities before the known dynasties emerged. That consistency is historically interesting. Now, consistency does not equal proof, but it does equal pattern. And patterns demand investigation rather than dismissal. When narratives align across cultures, separated by geography, historians take notice. Imagine standing in a desert at dusk, the wind moving across, stone blocks larger than buses, shadows stretching across ruins older than Rome, older than Greece, older than recorded monarchy. You feel small. That feeling of smallness is precisely how ancient texts describe encounters with giants. Grasshopper comparisons, overwhelming stature, cities fortified beyond reach, architecture that communicates dominance before a single word is spoken. The flood narrative claims that entire civilizations were destroyed, their cities submerged or buried. If massive pre-flood urban centers existed, we would expect remnants buried beneath layers of later habitation and sedimentary accumulation. Archaeology does reveal buried cities. Jericho has multiple layers. So does Troy. So do numerous Near Eastern sites. Civilizations rise, fall, and are built over repeatedly. That part is well documented. But what intrigues viewers is the disproportion between the earliest layers and the later ones in some regions. Larger stones, broader foundations, more ambitious initial platforms followed by scaled-down reconstructions centuries later. Is that because early builders had more manpower, different social organization, lost engineering methods? Or is it because memory amplified stature over generations, transforming skilled architects into giants in the cultural imagination? The responsible answer is, we do not know fully. What we do know is that the ancient world experienced dramatic resets through floods, invasions, climate shifts, and societal collapse. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered repeatedly. Enoch's account presents a theological explanation. Knowledge transmitted prematurely led to corruption, resulting in judgment and loss. Whether taken literally or symbolically, it frames early civilization as unusually accelerated. If early civilization was accelerated, then pre-flood urban centers may have been more advanced than we assume. After the flood, humanity restarted under survival conditions, rebuilding gradually rather than immediately replicating former scale. That would explain the pattern of diminishing scale in some archaeological contexts without invoking supernatural masonry. It would also explain why later generations preserved legends of a former age when builders seemed larger than life. So when we stand before buried desert foundations and ask who built this, the honest answer is ancient humans. But the deeper question is what kind of world shaped those humans before the Great Reset? Because sometimes the most powerful mysteries are not about giants physically walking through sand, but about civilizations that rose quickly, fell catastrophically, and left behind foundations so massive they still provoke awe thousands of years later. Now, let us widen the lens even further, because buried cities are not limited to desert sands alone. And the deeper we dig into ancient layers of civilization, the more we realize that human history is far more cyclical than linear, rising and collapsing in dramatic waves. Consider Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a site dated to roughly 11,000 years ago, featuring massive stone pillars arranged in complex circular patterns long before conventional timelines say humans developed organized urban architecture. The discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about early human capability, because it suggested advanced symbolic thought and coordinated labor existed earlier than previously accepted. Long before large agricultural cities formally appeared, no giants were excavated there. No 12-foot skeletons emerged from the soil. But the sophistication of the structure reshaped conversations about early civilization, revealing that humanity's developmental curve may not be as simple as textbooks once suggested. Now connect that to the flood narrative. Many ancient cultures preserve memories of a catastrophic deluge that reshaped the world. Mesopotamian epics, biblical accounts, and regional traditions echo a global or regional destruction event. If a large-scale catastrophe disrupted early settlements, then the archaeological record would naturally show gaps, resets, and reconstruction phases. Entire technological systems could vanish within a few generations under survival pressure. This does not require giants to physically carry stones the size of trucks. It requires only one thing: that pre-catastrophe, societies possessed capabilities later generations struggled to immediately replicate under drastically changed conditions. Enoch frames the pre-flood world as morally corrupt but technologically advanced. Again, whether literal or literary, the narrative suggests acceleration followed by sudden collapse, a theme consistent with historical patterns across civilizations. Look at the Roman Empire. Infrastructure spanning continents, roads, aqueducts, engineering, marvels. After its fall, Europe did not instantly replicate that scale. Knowledge fragmented, regions decentralized. Reconstruction took centuries. Scale can diminish without invoking mythology. But mythology often preserves emotional memory of lost scale, transforming powerful ancestors into giants in the collective imagination of a rebuilding society trying to make sense of former greatness. Now imagine early survivors after a catastrophic flood event. Cities destroyed, populations reduced, infrastructure gone. Generations later, descendants hear stories of towering figures and magnificent cities that existed before the waters came. Memory amplifies. Oral tradition magnifies. The extraordinary becomes enormous. Skilled rulers become giants. Advanced builders become titans. Architecture becomes the work of beings larger than life. But here is the key insight that makes this conversation compelling without sensationalism. Even if giants were symbolic, the sense of overwhelming power they represent remains historically consistent with human experience. Throughout history, civilizations repeatedly construct systems so large they appear unassailable: megacities, empires, monumental architecture, towers reaching skyward as declarations of dominance. Then collapse reshapes everything. Genesis describes the Tower of Babel as humanity's attempt to centralize power and ascend symbolically toward heaven. Whether literal or theological narrative, it reflects a recurring human impulse toward scale and control. That impulse produces monumental architecture. It produces systems that intimidate smaller communities. It produces a psychological experience of facing something too large to challenge. That is precisely how giant narratives function. So when archaeology reveals buried foundations that feel oversized compared to surrounding later structures, we are witnessing the physical echo of ambition at its peak before decline altered the trajectory of those societies. The tension Americans feel when watching footage of massive ancient ruins is not rooted in fear of supernatural beings. It is rooted in awe at human potential and curiosity about what was lost. Lost techniques, lost cultural cohesion, lost organizational capacity, sometimes lost morality. Because many collapse narratives in ancient texts connect technological acceleration with ethical deterioration, followed by catastrophic reset. That pattern does not require mystical speculation. It requires honest reflection on how societies behave when power expands faster than wisdom. The flood story encodes that warning in unforgettable imagery, and here is where the viral tension truly lives. Not in claiming that giants physically roam beneath desert sands, but in asking whether early humanity once reached heights we have forgotten, only to reset under judgment and restart history smaller. When viewers see an enormous stone foundation buried beneath sand and read about giants in ancient texts, the imagination connects dots instinctively. Our responsibility is to examine those connections without distorting evidence. So what happened to the giants after the flood? Perhaps the better framing is this: what happened to the world that inspired giant narratives in the first place? What level of scale and ambition existed before catastrophe interrupted it? The archaeological record suggests humanity is capable of extraordinary coordination far earlier than once believed. The biblical narrative suggests early acceleration followed by moral collapse. Together they form a compelling investigative tension. We do not need to manufacture fear. We do not need sensational claims. The mystery is powerful enough on its own. Buried cities, massive foundations, ancient texts describing overwhelming figures tied to early civilization. Whether giants were literal, exaggerated, or symbolic representations of scale, the ruins remain. They stand under desert suns and shifting winds, challenging modern assumptions about the simplicity of ancient humanity. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: history is layered. Beneath every civilization lies another. Beneath every era of dominance lies forgotten ambition. Beneath every reset lies a memory that resurfaces in story form. The giants after the flood may not be skeletons waiting beneath sand. They may be the memory of scale itself, preserved through narrative to remind future generations that ambition without boundary eventually collapses under its own weight. That is not conspiracy. That is pattern. And patterns are what serious investigation follows carefully, without fear and without exaggeration, until the evidence speaks as clearly as the ruins rising from the desert floor.